I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a busload of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives, random music topics, and even album reviews. Before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to Velocities in Music wherever you listen to your podcasts, and you'll automatically get our latest podcast episodes sent to your device so you can listen to at your leisure. Want to help Velocities in Music grow? You can. Velocities in Music was founded on the idea of creating an enriching discussion about modern music. Please share Velocities in Music with the music enthusiasts in your life, and together we can move music discussion forward. Tom Hummer.
Yes.
I am so excited for this topic that we're going to talk about today. Will you do us the honor of sharing what our discussion is for Velocities in Music on this fine day?
Well, with pleasure. So, this is a topic that came by request of Ryan Campbell. Ryan has been a part of the past several Velocities in Music leagues and has actually won a couple of them. So we owe Ryan a couple of podcasts. But,
oh, yes, we do.
But if anyone's wondering what the Velocities in Music league is, we do these typically 8-week leagues where we have topics. Everyone submits songs, votes on their favorite songs, and the winners of those, we let them pick a podcast topic. And Jake, we're a little bit behind on that, but we're doing our best to make good on them. And so we're doing this one for Ryan. Ryan, thanks for participating in the music leagues and all that you contribute to them. So this topic is all about at what point is it right or wrong, okay, not okay for a band to keep their name, to continue playing under the same name after the loss of a band member. And that could be loss of a band member from them quitting, being kicked out, maybe just because they pass away. Could happen for a number of reasons. But at what point, essentially, does a band stop being that band and become something else? I love this topic because it's so amorphous and subjective, and that's what we're all about here. Like, we just want to have an open, subjective conversation about music. So I'm not really sure where we'll land on this, Jake. We haven't prepped for this one a whole lot. We have a list of bands that we think are good examples of this phenomenon happening, bands that have continued using the same name after they've lost key members, bands that have split up, and you know, kind of the opposite of that, had the tact to just change the name of the band. And all of these are kind of interesting case studies, but I'm not really sure where we'll land on this because Jake and I haven't talked about this a lot. And our thoughts do tend to converge, Jake, but I wonder if maybe we might even get a little bit of disagreement here. I'm not sure.
Maybe. I hope so, Tom, because you're too agreeable. Yeah, you're too agreeable. So the first artist that comes to my mind when we started thinking about this topic is Joy Division. Joy Division. Obviously, you know, Tom, I don't know. Would you give a little bit of a history around Joy Division? I don't want to butcher it, and you're the music historian of the show. So
1979 and 1980, Joy Division put out two, what are now considered very seminal post-punk albums with Unknown Pleasures and Closer. And now, then Ian Curtis, at I think the age of 26, committed suicide and died. The rest of the band members decided to go on making music, but changed the name to New Order. And New Order became a huge band in the 80s, really established a new identity for themselves, and continued making some kick-ass music, some really, some albums that are just as critically acclaimed as the two albums that Joy Division put out during their tenure. So that's a quick overview, but I think it's a really good example to start with, Jake, because this actually is, kind of the opposite of what we're talking about when we say, bands moving on with the same name but with different members, because with the loss of just one member, these guys decided to just wipe the slate clean and start making new music under a different name. And to me, in this particular situation, because Ian Curtis died and died so tragically, I find this to be a really respectful example. Because what they had accomplished as Joy Division could not have been done without Ian Curtis. And so I think that if New Order had maintained the Joy Division name, we would have thought of there being still two very distinctive eras of that band, and it would almost just get a little confusing. It'd be like, well, there's Ian Curtis era Joy Division, and then there's post Ian Curtis era Joy Division, and like I think that it's necessary at that point to establish a new identity, because you have, you know, a very pivotal member of the group not there anymore. So I think it makes sense from a musical perspective. I think it's a respectful move for them in honoring Ian Curtis's memory, and not, not that Joy Division, or I'm sorry, not that New Order's music would have tainted the Joy Division name, but it would have made us think of them differently. You also have to think from a musical perspective too. It's not all just about respecting the deceased in this case. I think there's also a case to be made that when you're operating under a different name, even if you have mostly the same members, it can kind of feel like a rebirth. It can kind of give you a creative boost and allow you to think outside of the confines of what you were doing previously. And I don't think that New Order would have been able to flourish if it had not been for that.
I agree. And what's interesting about that is I love this example just from a standpoint that I got into Joy Division before I got into New Order. All within the last, several years, 5 or 6 years or so, and obviously love Joy Division. I both the two Joy Division albums I just think are so incredible, and I come back to them on a regular basis. But what I inevitably realize is that New Order is really, really fucking good. Yeah, and they have several albums but they're completely different though than Joy Division, and that's what makes it so. Such a key example is it's. They change styles so much. Ian Curtis dying, not only changed the entire personality of the remaining members of the band, but it affected them in the music that they wanted to make anyways. Mm-hmm. So that natural just shift in complete, almost, I would say it's fully different genres. Yes, you can hear similarities, but they approached music from an entirely different perspective. So it makes sense that we have new music. We basically are a new band because one of our key members is no longer here. Yeah, let's change the band. And I think that actually makes sense. Mm-hmm. Now, I think another interesting scenario that I want to bring up is Paul McCartney and his solo records. Yeah. Because the first, Paul McCartney's first couple solo records, McCartney 1 and then Ram, he released as Paul McCartney. But then, I think, was it, Tom, did Wings start right after Ram, or was it a couple more?
Yeah, I think technically Band on the Run would have been the first.
Yep.
Like around that time, or maybe it was Wildlife, Wings Wildlife. I think that was technically the first Wings album. I'd have to look that up.
Right, but regardless, it doesn't matter, because the way that I remember it is, Wings or not, it's Paul McCartney. Right. And I'm not alone in this. Most people seem to identify Wings as just like a subset of Paul McCartney's solo work rather than an independent band. His name is just too powerful that even when he tried to be in another band, he just couldn't be. It was Paul McCartney.
I'm certainly in the camp that I actually saw Jake in a vinyl Facebook group that we're in recently. I saw a post of someone asking, how do you categorize your Wings and Paul McCartney albums? And I just put them all together under Paul McCartney, honestly.
Most people do. Most record stores I've been to, that's the way it is.
Yeah, because, and I want to be respectful of how they choose to label themselves, but at the same time, it's my record collection, and I'm going to listen to stuff how I want to listen to stuff. And
you don't have to respect them in your own home.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. It's my collection.
They have to respect you. It's your home.
It's my collection, and I'll organize it how I want to, damn it. So the point is, when I'm going to listen to a Wings album, I'm going to it because I'm in a Paul McCartney mood. And I want to see those albums together to think about which one I want to pick. So it just makes sense to me. But I understand from his perspective, he had kind of a more consistent group of collaborators at that point in time, including his wife, Linda. So it kind of, it made sense to maybe think of it as more of a band. And honestly, it's one of those things that you have to think of it from an artistic mindset as well. What does it mean for him? And I think it's one of those things that putting the label Wings on it might have done more for Paul McCartney as an artist than it did for us as listeners.
Oh, absolutely.
We might think of it still just as, it's another Paul McCartney record.
Yeah, he's like poking us with a stick.
Right. But maybe him just putting the Wings label on him made him feel a little bit more relaxed to do what he wanted to do because it wasn't just his name sitting heavy on it. Maybe to us it still was, but if it changed things in his mind enough, then that could make all the difference in the world, I think.
Yep. Now, to contrast these examples, Tom, I'd like to shift to a band you may know a little bit about, and that's Metallica.
Oh, yeah,
so,
Metallica.
We did a Metallica deep dive a couple years ago. By the way, still can't stop listening to Metallica. It's been a couple years just nonstop listening to Metallica, but you know which albums I come back to every single time? Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets. The first three Metallica albums, also the first three that had Cliff Burton, the bassist, and he had a very dynamic role, literally dynamic role, in their songwriting process on those three albums, specifically Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets. Why do I keep coming back to those? Well, A, they're the best, but B, that's original Metallica. That's Metallica in its purest form. Cliff Burton dies in a tragic bus accident shortly after Master of Puppets is released, and the band picks up and carries on. They release Justice for All after they get their new bassist, Jason Newsted, and then you have Black Album and all the 90s albums that we choose not to talk about. But, that's a crash course in Metallica. So I have a hard time with this one. And the reason why I have a hard time with it is I genuinely really don't like the Metallica era that came after Cliff Burton died. Yeah. And I almost wish they would have changed their name, that they would have formed as a different band.
That's interesting.
And then regrouped in the 2000s in the Robert, I can't pronounce his last name. I apologize. Yeah. There. And, when they started doing Death Magnetic and then the most recent album, I would have liked that to have been a callback to former Metallica. But, that's just me. I really struggle with Metallica in the aftermath of Cliff Burton's death. And obviously Injustice for All and even Black Album, I think, still fit with the original three records. But I just think that their sound went through such a slow dynamic change or stylistic change after Cliff died that it really just it wasn't the same band, and because he was such a force in their songwriting process. And that's what I think is key, is when an artist loses a member of their band, whether it to be to death, whether it's they just left and went on to do other things. If it depends, what really matters is the role that they played in the band. Not only from like a cultural perspective of what does society recognize as, the band. Radiohead, my favorite band. I got to bring up Radiohead on every podcast episode.
Yep.
Do I think of Radiohead as Tom York? No, it's not. It's the whole band, because Tom York's solo stuff pales in comparison to most of Radiohead's work. But if Tom were to leave Radiohead and they got another singer, would I still want them to be called Radiohead? Hell no. He's too much a centerpiece of that band to be able for him to leave and have the band still stay intact. And that's really the big problem that I see is with this whole argument, is it really is just going to depend on that band. And what was the role of the person who left? Like, how many different bassists did Black Sabbath have, or guitarists, or lead singers did they have?
Every member of Black Sabbath, singer, drummer, bass player, guitarist, changed. Well, actually, I think Tony Iommi as the guitarist is the one that stayed the most consistent. But they kept the Black Sabbath name through a lot of different lineup changes that I think significantly changed their sound. Now, I'll say this. And I want to relate this back to something you said, Jake, because I think there's opportunity for some good disagreement here.
I love to disagree.
Let's get at it. So Black Sabbath, when Ozzy left in the late 70s and Ronnie James Dio joined, and they had a slew of other artists or other singers through the 80s and even the 90s, while they kept the Black Sabbath name before they did end up eventually changing the name to Heaven and Hell. But at that point, the band had gone through so many iterations that it's like, well, they didn't really resemble Black Sabbath anymore anyway, so changing the name to Heaven and Hell feels rather arbitrary. But anyway, this is an example that I think is rich within itself that we could rant about forever, but I'll try to sum up my thoughts on it. The thing is, Jake, Black Sabbath's first 5 albums are about as influential and as perfect a run of albums as you can get from a band. They are
Agreed.
iconic. They launched the heavy metal musical genre. Mm-hmm. But there are still a lot of people out there who prefer Dio era Black Sabbath.
Right.
Now, I don't think anyone would argue that it was more influential or more iconic or more pivotal.
That's just their preference.
But they just prefer that sound better.
Same thing with like Sammy Hagar era Van Halen versus David Lee Roth.
Absolutely. Everyone has a preference, right? Some people prefer Hagar versus Diamond Dave. That's fair. You can have your preference. But to me, it comes back to what you said about, did that person define or determine or contribute to the band's sound enough for it to feel like a different band? And to me, like, I still like Dio era Black Sabbath, but it feels like a different enough band to me that I kind of would have preferred them just changing the name back then. That's just my preference. So the tough thing is, I don't know how much quality really plays a part in it, because that's going to be subjective anyway. Like you mentioned, Jake, that the Cliff Burton era Metallica albums are the best ones, and I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to argue with you there. But just because,
I mean, you probably would though, because And Justice for All.
Okay, that's true. I do love And Justice for All, but the thing to me is, I think, and I'm not saying that you said this, but I'm saying I think it would be too simple to just say, well, if the lineup change makes a band worse, then they should have changed their name. Because the fact is, bands can get worse within the same lineup. Bands are still going to change their sound even when they have the same members. I mean, look at Rush. Rush had the same lineup of 3 guys after their first album when John Rutsey, the original drummer, left and Neil Peart joined. They had the same lineup for about 40 years almost. Yep. And they changed their sound considerably. They went through periods where their music was arguably brilliant and periods where the music arguably was not that good. But they were still the same 3 guys. They still had the same ethos going into the music creating process. So it makes sense for them to keep their name and not just change their name every time they had a style change, because they had a lot of style changes.
And I think that's the key word right there. Ethos.
Yeah.
Is when one of the members leaves, does the ethos of the group and what it stands for, because it's more than just the tangible nature of it. Like, oh yeah, Jimmy left the band and he took his guitar with him, but has what the band stands for actually changed? And some of these bands, like Black Sabbath is a great example, that once they've established themselves, they seem to transcend just the band or being like a signature group. They transcend and become more of like this movement. They represent something in music history and music canon that has legacy, and that legacy deserves the brand of that band, right? So Iron Maiden's another good example. Pink Floyd, for instance. Pink Floyd has gone through a number of different significant singers. Yeah. Syd Barrett to Roger Waters. And do I like Pink Floyd post Roger Waters? Not really. But do I like Pink Floyd before Roger Waters? No, I'm really selective. I like Roger Waters era Pink Floyd. Yeah. And I still say that I'm a Pink Floyd fan, even though that like I consider myself like very knowledgeable on just the Roger Waters era. But before and after, I'm just like, oh, who cares? Like it doesn't matter to me. But is that fair? Like, no, it's about, I like what Pink Floyd stands for, what they came to do, which was to fundamentally rethink how to present rock music. Yeah. I like that ethos. And so I think ethos has a lot to do with it.
That's a great point. And I actually think, while I kind of fall off the Pink Floyd train in the 80s and 90s as well, they still got some good stuff. But I think that even without Waters, they do maintain a similar ethos. And I think it makes sense to keep the name there, but as you said, Jake, it also makes sense for fans to just have their preference of what era they like better. Right. So I'd like to explore a few artists then that actually identify themselves as really just having one key member. I think this is culturally something that we see a lot actually in jazz. I mean, think about jazz music. Miles Davis, Charles Mingus, like, they were rotating band members out all the time, and that's the whole point of jazz, right? It centers around one band leader who has a vision for their work they're doing. They get the right people in the room, and because the changing lineups, the sound on each album is going to be very different. Yet, despite like Miles Davis as being a very obvious example, think about Miles Davis's 50s versus 60s versus 70s output and beyond. They have very distinctive eras, but there is a flow there. There's an evolution there that represents Miles as a person. So it still makes sense. I don't think it would have made sense for him to have like Miles Davis and the whatever you want to call him. Like, I think it makes sense for each of those to remain a Miles Davis album.
Yeah, and there's parallels between jazz and hip hop too, with all the feature. It's really about collaborations and featured artists, right?
Getting the right people in the room. With hip hop, even more so, like the producers that you have. I mean, how much did Eminem's sound change after he stopped having Dre produce all the beats? Stuff like that. But there's a couple other good examples, like King Crimson. King Crimson has been an ever-evolving prog outfit that has had a number of different lineup changes, number of different lead singers, but it all centers around Robert Fripp as a guitarist. And it's fascinating to me that Robert Fripp has embodied that musical ethos, even though he's not a singer. I think a lot of people in pop and rock music tend to hyper-focus on the singer, but really Robert Fripp as a guitarist is King Crimson's sound and soul.
Absolutely.
And whether it's Greg Lake or Adrian Belew or whoever singing, there's still something there that's very decidedly King Crimson. It's kind of unmistakable. Even though their 80s stuff sounds very different from their early stuff, it's still, there's enough work in between and enough small steps that they made to get there that if you listen to their albums chronologically, it still makes sense as an evolving band's story.
He really missed a problem. He had a problem there because he says such a cool name, Fripp, by disassociating the band name King Crimson with his name, he really missed out on some really cringy punny album names.
Oh God.
Like
what?
A Fripple in Time or the Frippuccino or something like that.
Fripp it and dip it. I think that would have ruined. Talk about band ethos. That's one way to destroy the image of a very ethereal band. But I love Robert Fripp. I love, he's such a badass. He just sits on stage on this stool and just shreds away, and that's his thing. He did that through every era of King Crimson. Another band that's similar in that regard, The Fall. Mark E. Smith of The Fall famously said once, I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have the quote up in front of me, but he said something along the lines of, if your granny's playing bongos and I'm singing, it's The Fall. It didn't matter who else was in the band, as long as Mark E. Smith was there, then it's The Fall. He identified himself as the band's trademark. So while there were a lot of lineup changes in the drums, bass, guitar, and so on, Mark E. Smith and his vocals and his general attitude is what defined that band, and it never ebbed away through their multiple decades as a band. So to me, it makes sense to keep that as The Fall, because that was Marky Smith's vision for the band as the beginning. Their sound stayed enough the same, carried enough of the same spirit, that I never found myself thinking, gosh, they should just call this a different band. It all makes sense as The Fall.
Yep. Another band I want to bring up is At the Drive-In.
Yeah.
Because when At the Drive-In split up and you had Omar and Cedric go off and form the Mars Volta and the other two members form Sparta, you really, that was a really interesting scenario because they all continued to make music, but they ended the former act and kind of put a bow on it until their most recent album came out, and then went off and did their own separate projects, which became their own things. And that's really, they could have kept the At the Drive-In moniker going, but they realized that they were splitting ways. They were making stylistic shifts in how they were creating their music. Everything changed. They were losing band members, no matter how you put it. The writing style, the the environment that the band makes music in was changing. The chemistry between the artists as they bring in new artists is changing. The ethos of the music changed. And so what At the Drive-In stood for no longer ceased to exist. And instead you had these iterations forming off of it. And I think that really made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I do think I prefer when a band is intentionally changing their lineup and changing their sound. That is a pretty, not 100%, but it's not like a hard rule, but I think that's a really good opportunity to consider a change in your name.
Yeah, I agree. When those changes are happening at the same time, it just makes sense. I think some interesting, really successful lineup changes are, like you mentioned, Iron Maiden. When Bruce Dickinson became the vocalist after Paul Di'Anno left, right before they made Number of the Beast in 1982, their third album. They had made 2 albums already as Iron Maiden, but hadn't really launched to the level of stardom yet. It was a slight stylistic shift, but the rest of the band was the same. Bruce Dickinson was working in a band called Samson that played a lot of shows with Iron Maiden at the time. They were kind of part of the same musical community. So it made sense to keep the same name in that case. I would also point out AC/DC. After Bon Scott died and Brian Johnson joined the band, they had already put out quite a few albums with Bon Scott, and Bon Scott was an iconic part of the band's sound. But I think that Brian Johnson, while I'm not even a huge AC/DC fan, I think that Brian Johnson carried the spirit of Bon Scott. He didn't have quite the same vocal quality, but it was odd enough in a similar way that it kind of brought that character. Also, to me, it's really Angus Young's guitar that is a cornerstone of that band's sound. So when Back in Black came out, also it helped them out that Back in Black became one of their most successful and critically acclaimed albums. People loved it. So the quality boost definitely helped in justifying that. But I think it made sense for them to keep the same name. Now, sometimes I feel when bands keep the same name, it feels a little bit like a cash grab. And that's where I have problems with it. Like, if the whole spirit of the band just changes, like, you got to move on. One that I feel is kind of guilty of that, as much as I love them, is Stone Temple Pilots. When Scott Weiland left the band, they got Chester Bennington from Linkin Park to take over. Chester Bennington's a great vocalist, but, like, they're not really the same band anymore. I mean, I think Scott Weiland was an integral enough part of their sound and had been for damn near 20 years that I think it would have made more sense for them to just start a new project. Honestly, I probably would have been more excited about it. If I heard, the guys from Stone Temple Pilots are teaming up with Chester to start a new band, that sounds cool. But it's all about expectations. And it also depends on whether you're forming more for live shows or more for studio work. Because definitely. I think the reason they kept the STP name is so they could tour and put on STP shows and play STP classics. And they wouldn't really be able to do that if they were operating under a different name.
They just wouldn't get the attendance that they would need to justify the expense.
Right. But at the same time, you have people like that who aren't going to go to it if it's a different band and a different name. And then you have sticklers like me who aren't going to go and see Stone Temple Pilots with a different singer. I would be more likely to go see them if they were writing original material with that different lineup, because I would want to see what those new songs sounded like in person. So to me, not the best example. They're still touring with another vocalist, Jeff Gutt. And, more power to them. I like the band a lot. I have a lot of respect for those guys, but it just doesn't really, I'm very emotionally attached to Stone Temple Pilots' early music. It was some of the first music I remember loving when I was a kid, so it just doesn't really excite me in the same way.
Yeah, that music is at the core of who you are. Right.
Another band that I feel like, this is an interesting and infamous example, is the Velvet Underground. After their first couple albums, when John Cale left, he was replaced on the bass by a guy named Doug Yule, and Doug Yule stuck around for their next couple albums, and then the rest of the band left. You don't have Sterling Morrison, you don't have Mo Tucker, you don't have John Cale, and you don't have Lou Reed. You just have Doug Yule, and he puts out this final quote unquote Velvet Underground album called Squeeze, that is famously bad. And I feel kind of bad for Doug Ewell, and I kind of don't feel bad for him at the same time, because
this is what you get, Doug.
Yeah, like you kept the Velvet Underground name going when arguably the core pieces of the band were not there anymore. To me, it felt a little like a cash grab and not like a true artistic expression. At the same time, cash grab I use loosely because it's not like the Velvet Underground at the time were really making bank. They were a relatively unknown band in the grand scheme of things until later on when their influence started to be recognized. But that, to me, just do it under a different name. That felt a little like a cop-out. A couple more recent examples that I'm kind of on the fence about, Jake, that I'd be interested in your take on are Boston and Journey. Boston and Journey are two kind of, mainstream classic rock bands who have reformed to do some shows, not as much recording, but more just doing, big arena, anything from arena shows to state fairs with new vocalists. Boston's original singer, Brad Delp, passed away. Journey's singer, Steve Perry, is just, he's wherever he is being Steve Perry. Steve Perry. And they got different vocalists to carry it on. I think, to me, what helps with that is these guys who are singing for them now were relatively unknown. They were just fans of the band that the rest of the band ended up saying, you know what, these guys sound really good. Let's keep playing and pull one of the fans into the mix. And in a way, I kind of respect that. I think it's kind of a cool way to honor that, just everyman approach where just, one of your fans could become the lead singer of your band. Mm-hmm. I think with bands like that too, it kind of helps with their, how should I say this? I think it works with their image because it's not like they're putting out a lot of groundbreaking music right now as it is. They just want to be able to play live in front of people. And I think they also have the kinds of fan bases who care more about the songs themselves than they do the people performing them.
Yes, the music has begun to transcend the band.
Right, exactly. People know those songs. They know the hits by Boston and Journey. And so people just want to go hear those songs be played. Mm-hmm. The vocalists are similar enough to the originals that they still get a lot of enjoyment from hearing them. And you know what? Godspeed to the instrumentalists in that band who get to go up on stage and play the songs that they had a hand in writing and that they love to play in front of people. Like, I don't really have a problem with it. At the same time, those are two bands that I don't really get excited enough about to go out of my way to see anyway. So it's kind of whatever.
Yeah. It's like going to a basketball game. It's just less interesting because you already know what's going to happen.
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, they play basketball arenas.
Yeah. Now, okay,
that joke wasn't going anywhere. I'm just going to let it lie.
Now I'm just picturing Journey playing at a basketball arena while basketball is being played. And this, my mind is
more
just
interested
fried.
in watching that. I really want to see that. I think it would make the Journey show more interesting. I actually saw Journey back in 2003 at Hilton and Ames.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they, obviously it was a different singer and everything, and it was fine. I mean, you knew the songs. You knew the 3 songs, the 4 or 5 songs, and that was it. And they played those songs. Cool. But, I don't really mind it so much because the music, like I said, had transcended the who actually plays it or who made it. The music is just in music canon at that point. And so the band kind of has to live on. And you can switch out any of the artists, and as long, whether it's an imitation band, you can have the imitation band be the actual band, and no one really cares because you're playing the right music.
Right.
And that's all that really matters once a band has reached that level. But if they haven't reached that level yet, it's a completely different statement. And really, it's about the art that's going into it as well. Mm-hmm. If the ethos of the band is to create a certain type of art, and then the lineup change causes them to no longer be able to create that certain type of art, they cannot continue to use that name and still produce that same quality of art. So at that point in time, it does make sense to change. But if you can continue that on with the remaining members and still stay within that same kind of vertical, I think it makes sense to change. But at any point, it depends on who that person is and what their role in the ethos and the art of the music and everything that goes into it. What is their role?
I totally agree, Jake. There are two more examples I want to give before we wrap this up. And these are two examples that bother me, that I'd be interested in your thoughts on. First one is Sublime with Rome. Sublime, Brad Knoll, the key guitarist, singer, and songwriter for the band, passed away in 1996 before their self-titled album came out and really made them huge. And then like 15 years later, approximately, they get together with this guy, Rome Ramirez, who has a very similar kind of voice, kind of similar songwriting style, guitar style, and they get together as Sublime with Rome, put out a new album, start touring and playing a lot of classic Sublime stuff. This one I'm torn on because to me feels a bit like a cash grab. I don't think that the new songs they were writing really carried the spirit of Brad Knoll enough. I think they should have just started a new band, but the problem is, I don't think they had. I think the problem is they realized that they didn't have a strong enough songwriter to take over songwriting duties to really get much buzz without just playing off of the Sublime name. And I think that's kind of shitty. At the same time, I'm sure in their eyes, they're seeing it as a way to honor their friend Brad's musical legacy. And yeah, maybe there's a little bit of that, but still to me, it just feels like you should have just used a different name. And then even more recently, back in 2011, Bud, the original drummer, left. So now they're touring as a trio with Josh Freese on drums. And, I'm not sure how active they still are, but at least as recent as like 2017, they were touring with Josh Freese on drums. The only original member was Eric Wilson, the bass player. And I'm like, that is just a completely different band at that point.
And as you know, as a bass players don't carry the band.
No, they really don't. I mean, I love Eric Wilson's bass playing, but it's not the defining characteristic. It plays its part, it contributes very well, but it's not the defining characteristic. The other example I want to give, Jake, is Fleetwood Mac. This is one of the strangest examples because here, where we talk about Sublime with Rome trying to play off the popularity of Sublime's success in the 90s, Fleetwood Mac really became more successful after their lineup changed. They started out as Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, and really they had put out like 10 albums before the core lineup, the classic lineup of Lindsey Buckingham, Stevie Nicks, Christine McVie, and John McVie. That's what people remember is the late 70s lineup with the self-titled album and Rumors and Tusk and so on. And people kind of forget that they put out like 10 frickin' albums before that even happened with Peter, some of which with Peter Green, who really was the band leader. So it's strange because Mick Fleetwood is really like the core consistent member of the band as the drummer, but really to me, like the drums on Fleetwood Mac are not the memorable part. It's the songwriting, it's the vocals, it's the guitar work. And Peter Green and Lindsey Buckingham brought very different guitar styles to the band. But to me, like, I don't understand why they kept the name, because the fact is, when they got to like self-titled and Rumors, when they became all of a sudden super mega stars, that wasn't riding off the success of their previous albums anyway. They were playing to a whole different audience. So I'm not really sure why they didn't just at some point in there decide to change names, because if they did, they probably would have still just been as successful as they were.
Potentially. I mean, with that one, that really seems to me, that example seems to be more not of a cash grab, but of a strategic business decision, because I mean, they weren't mega popular before Nix and Buckingham join, but they had been around long enough that they had connections in the record industry. They knew how to get in front of the right people. And so then you get the right talent level, and basically it's like you make a run at popularity. They get super, super big. And then from there on out, after those two left, keeping the name, that is the true cash grab. It's like, well, what have they really done? What have you done for me recently, sort of thing? And the answer is really not. At that point, you could just change the name because but like the artist is incentivized not to, because they can make more money by keeping the old name.
Yeah, true.
So that's where it becomes, what is the ethos? Is it, has the band transcended to that level? And I think with Fleetwood Mac, you would argue that they have they transcended to the level of where you're just part of musical canon, and so the brand lives on no matter what, whether you want it to or not? Or is it that they're just trying to make money? It's a tough call, and a lot of times it's a very fuzzy line in between those two outcomes. So as we said at the beginning, that episode was for Ryan Campbell, a winner of several of Velocities in Music leagues. And you can participate in any Velocities in Music league with us whenever we start them up. All you need to do is shoot us an email at All you need to do is shoot us an email at velocitiesinmusic@gmail.com. Be sure to check out the site musicleague.app to start your own music league with your friends. What is Music League? Music League is a game amongst music enthusiasts like Tom and myself, where each week every league member submits a song to a blind playlist. You vote on your favorite songs, and you attempt to win the league by getting the most overall votes. If that sounds interesting, check out musicleague.app to get started. It's completely free, and it's a great way to connect with people over music. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages, and your emails to us. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible. So as always, thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.